They said he was born of woman, but that was not the whole truth. The midwives may have witnessed the blood and breath of his arrival, but the priests knew better. Long before his first cry echoed through palace halls, long before his eyes adjusted to the golden light of Thebes, his soul had already been chosen, molded by unseen hands, whispered into being by gods who wove purpose into blood. From the moment he drew breath, the boy was watched not as heir, but as vessel. The world around him was not merely sky and soil, but the body of gods, the Nile a vein, the sun a living eye. His every step was ritual, though he did not yet know it. He was taught to walk with precision, to speak only in alignment with the sacred rhythm. He did not play with other children, he listened, to the silence behind the priests chanting, to the breath between the beating drums, to the pause in a servant's footfall. Every moment of his young life was a preparation, not to rule men, but to carry a god. When the time came, he stood before the temple doors, stripped not of clothing, but of self. His name was not spoken, only remembered. The high priest stepped forward, holding not a crown, but the breath of Ra itself, a ritual so old no tongue could recite its origin. And then, in a chamber veiled in myrrh and darkness, it was done. The words were whispered over his head, not loud but final. The breath entered him not through mouth or lungs, but through marrow. He inhaled the sun, and in that breath he ceased to be mortal. The coronation was not spectacle, but summoning. The god Horus, falcon-eyed and watchful, descended not from sky, but from memory, a presence older than time, woven into royal bones. In that moment, the boy was gone. The king who stepped forward bore his face, but his gaze had changed. It no longer scanned the horizon like a man, but pierced it like a flame through veil. People wept at the sight, not from grief, but from recognition they had seen a god reborn. But with this divinity came weight. Pharaohs were not worshipped for vanity. They bore responsibility not to be loved, but to uphold truth, balance, the invisible thread that kept the cosmos from unraveling. Each gesture of his hand could sway the Nile. Each lie could break the sky. He ate under observance, slept under stars arranged by priests. Every decision, no matter how small, reverberated through seen and unseen realms. To err was not human. It was treason against the eternal. He spoke rarely in public, not out of silence, but containment. His voice, believed to carry echoes of creation itself, was measured sacred. It was said that when a pharaoh broke his silence, winds shifted, crops responded. The divine was not above the earth, it was in it, channeled through his breath, his blood, his will. To the people, he was not just the bridge between gods and men, he was the bridge, but even gods could grow weary. In the stillness of night, surrounded by incense and golden silence, the pharaoh sometimes stared into the eyes of Horus carved on the temple walls. Did he feel the weight of expectation, the impossibility of perfection? Perhaps, but he did not waver. Not because he believed he was immortal, but because he knew others needed to believe he was. Faith, after all, was not sustained by facts, but by the breath behind the veil. So when he walked among his people, barefoot across temple stone, even the elderly bowed low. Not to a man, but to a memory made flesh. And as he passed, their hearts calmed, their breath slowed. For in his presence they remembered the gods had not abandoned them. The pharaoh lived, and through him, so did eternity. In silence, the Pharaoh whispered to eternity, and the walls answered. Not with sound, but with symbols that shimmered beneath torchlight, etched deep into the stone where no wind could reach them. These were not letters as we know them, but living entities, breathless prayers forged from shape and silence, carved into immortality. In the still chambers of pyramids and temples, where only dust and memory dwell, they remain, staring back, undisturbed and very much awake. The language of the gods was never meant to be spoken freely. Hieroglyphs were not simply written, they were conjured. Each symbol was a being, each phrase a spell. A feather did not represent the sound Mot, it was Mot, goddess of truth and cosmic balance. To inscribe her form was to invoke her presence. The pharaoh understood this, just as he understood the stakes. Ink could fade, parchment could burn, but stone listened, stone remembered. In the deepest corridors of sacred temples, entire walls became scriptures, but not for human eyes. Many of these texts were positioned in such a way that they were never intended to be read aloud, not even by the priests who carved them. They adorned hidden chambers, ceilings that could only be glimpsed from above by the gods themselves. To modern minds, this seems a contradiction. Why write what no one will read? But to the pharaoh, that was the point. He wasn't writing for men, he was writing to the eternal. There is a reason why tombs were sealed with curses, not to frighten the curious, but to protect the spell. Words once disturbed could unravel. Magic, once witnessed by the unworthy, could wither. Pharaohs believed in the permanence of form. To name something was to give it shape, to chisel it in stone was to give it soul. The deeper the carving, the stronger the spirit. Some corridors were lined entirely with stars, glyphs that weren't just decorative, but functional. They weren't telling a story, they were being one. Describing the night sky wasn't enough, the pharaoh wished to enter it. Through spell and stone, he would ascend into the stars, not metaphorically, but literally as a being of light. To carve was to prepare the path, not for memory, for transformation. The pyramid texts, some of the oldest sacred writings on earth, were inscribed not where the living walked, but where the dead lay. The chamber was small, the words enormous. They covered every inch. Even the ceiling above the coffin was filled with constellations and invocations. In that darkness, surrounded by impossible quiet, the pharaoh lay embalmed, but not asleep. The spells around him were still breathing. He was being read into the sky. And then there were the false doors, carved gateways on tomb walls, leading nowhere, yet always open. These were portals for the Ka, the vital life force of the dead. Through them, the spirit could step into the world, receive offerings, and return. Around these doors were lists, not of achievements, but of words. Exact recitations, names, titles, spells. They were not decorations, they were sustenance. The pharaoh needed them not to be remembered, but to continue. Each hieroglyph carried layers, a phonetic sound, a meaning, and a divine resonance. Some were shaped like animals, others like gods. Each stroke summoned more than sound, it awakened presence. The scribe who carved was not a writer, but a priest. Each tool was purified, each glyph offered. It was not enough to be correct, it had to be true. To err in stone was to misalign the soul. Behind closed doors, pharaohs had special inscriptions known only to them. Secret names, hidden gods, personal spells, these were kept away even from high priests. They believed that to reveal one's true name was to surrender power. And so they cloaked themselves in titles, layers of identity, but somewhere, always, the true word remained hidden. Carved deep into foundation blocks, whispered only once, then sealed. The fear of being forgotten was not an ego's panic, but a soul's death. In Egypt, oblivion was not what happened when the heart stopped beating, but when the name was no longer spoken, when no offering was made, when the walls no longer told your story. This is why names were inscribed 100 times in a single tomb. Why statues bore labels on the back, beneath robes, hidden beneath arms, so that even if the face eroded, the name remained. And so pharaohs became obsessed with what could endure. Their words did not merely describe reality, they preserved it. If a ritual was forgotten, a spell misspoken, the world could tilt into chaos. The pharaoh carried the burden of memory. To speak was to create. To carve was to preserve creation. But stone, though strong, is not eternal. Wind eats it, water softens it, even memory grows weary. So they built redundancy, layers of the same lines across temples far apart. If one fell, another would speak. If one name was lost, another inscription would call it back. Eternity, they knew, was not a promise, it was a practice. Sometimes within the inscriptions, there are intentional blank spaces, gaps where names were meant to be filled but never were. These are not errors, they are invitations. They awaited a pharaoh yet to come, a soul yet to rise. They believed that time was not linear but circular, and one day someone would return who would fit that shape. They prepared not just for their afterlife, but for someone else's destiny. And still today the stones speak. Though weathered, though broken, some glyphs still glow with the fire of intention. Scholars may raid them, tourists may pass them, but deep inside something else listens. The magic, though dormant, remains embedded. Unseen hands still carry the names, whisper them beneath the sand in the breathless pause between footsteps. The pharaoh's body may be gone, his tomb plundered, his dynasty reduced to dust. But his words are still here. They cling to granite like breath clings to a mirror, waiting, watching, whispering not to us but through us. Because in the silence of those walls, the pharaoh does not ask to be remembered, he demands it. The gods didn't speak in temples, they spoke in sleep. Not in thunder or flame, but in symbols and shadows, soft voices threading through silence like wind through linen. In ancient Egypt, the line between waking and dreaming was not a boundary, it was a threshold. And pharaohs, more than any others, knew to kneel at its edge. When a pharaoh closed his eyes, he did not merely rest. He descended. Through veils of memory and myth, he entered a sacred landscape shaped by gods and guarded by silence. Dreams were not his escape, they were his summons. A space where the mortal self gave way to the divine listener, where hierarchies collapsed and even kings waited, breathless, for a whisper. Priests prepared the space with great care. The dream chamber, not open to the public, not carved with public words, was always hidden deep within the temple, wrapped in stone and shadow. They lined it with incense, softened the light with copper lamps. Offerings were placed, milk, beer, sacred oil, and garlands of blue lotus, known to blur the edge between worlds. Silence was enforced not as absence, but as invitation. Every breath in that room was shaped by intention to open the gate and to hear. The pharaoh did not enter alone. He was escorted by dream priests, chosen not for political influence, but for their purity and silence. They bore with them amulets of sleep, stones blessed in moonlight, and scrolls etched with invocation spells. Their role was not to guide the king, but to keep the path open. Once he crossed into the sacred sleep, no one could follow, only watch. Only wait. He lay down on a slab carved not as a bed, but as a vessel shaped like the bark of Ra, curved to cradle the body as if sailing through the sky. His limbs were aligned with the stars. His breath matched the rhythm of ceremonial drums, beaten so faintly they became pulse, and when all was still, he let go. To dream was not a passive act, it was a practice, a discipline, and for pharaohs, a responsibility. The gods did not call every night, but when they did, their voice arrived strange, cloaked in images, symbols, riddles. A vulture with a broken wing, a well that boiled with ink, a child born from sand. These were not dreams, they were messages, each a cipher from another realm, and when the pharaoh awoke, he did not speak immediately. He was given warm wine laced with blue lotus to ease the return. His body remained still, even as his mind flickered with meanings. The dream priests waited in silence until he gave a single nod, the sign that something had come, that the veil had opened. Then began the sacred retelling, not to an audience but to the temple's dream scribe who sat with ochre and ink writing down the fragments, not interpreting, not judging, simply recording. Every detail mattered. The time of night the vision began, the position of the moon, the color of the pharaoh's robe, the scent in the air. Even a pause in his breath could shift the meaning. Because dreams, they believed, did not come from within, they came from beyond. Often, the gods did not appear as themselves. Horus might arrive as a burning hawk that refused to speak. Thoth as a black ibis who circled the pharaoh's bed and vanished at dawn. These were signs, not appearances, and it was up to the priests and sometimes the pharaoh himself to interpret them. Misreading a dream could tilt the kingdom, but hearing it truly, that could save it. Some dreams warned of plague or rebellion. Others whispered of alignment, the right moment to strike, to build, to bless. There are records of pharaohs who changed military campaigns after a single night's vision, who halted construction on great temples because a god appeared with a broken crown, who abandoned alliances because a serpent appeared in the mouth of a trusted friend, not literally, but in the unseen world, where meaning was sharper than metal. But not all dreams were for strategy. Some were for the soul. There are accounts of pharaohs weeping upon waking, unable to describe what they saw, only that they were held by something vast and sorrowful. Dreams of ancestors, of children unborn, of gods who didn't speak but only stared. These were kept secret, carved not in stone but remembered in silence. They were not warnings, they were reminders of mortality, of duty, of the cost of being more than human. In rare cases, pharaohs were said to receive names in dreams, new names, names no one had heard before. These became secret identities, soul names known only to the king and the gods, spoken once in private ritual, then never again. for to speak such a name twice was to weaken its power. These names were never carved, never shared, and yet they shaped destinies. Like a breath drawn and never exhaled, the temples dedicated to Serapis, Bastet, and Imhotep became known for their dream chambers even for ordinary people. Those desperate for healing or answers would sleep on sacred floors seeking visions, but for pharaohs the path was deeper. Their dreams weren't requests, they were mandates. Where others hoped for healing, the king awaited command. And sometimes silence was the answer. Nights passed with no dreams, no symbols, no signs. These were not failures, they were tests. Could the pharaoh continue to act without guidance? Could he bear the absence? Silence itself was a dream, one where the gods watched but said nothing. As time went on, some pharaohs began recording their visions on temple walls, veiled in poetic riddles. Others built sanctuaries where they could dream undisturbed for days. There are rumors of a pharaoh who spent 40 nights in solitude, fasting and sleeping beneath the stars, seeking one word. When he returned, he spoke nothing, only ordered a temple to be built facing the rising moon. To this day, no one knows why. We look at their monuments and think of labor, wealth, ambition. But beneath those stones are dreams, quiet, weightless, and eternal. The pharaohs understood something we often forget, that truth does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers in sleep when all else is still, and so they listened, night after night, eyes closed, hearts open, waiting not for thunder but for breath. For the moment when the gods leaned close and spoke, not in temples but in dreams. To rule the living, they first had to master the dead. This was the unspoken law behind the crown, the secret truth whispered in corridors far from light. A pharaoh was not only a god among men, but a traveler through the shadows, long before death dared to touch his skin. His throne was carved not just of stone, but of prophecy, a life built in rehearsal for a death that was never the end. They called it the Jewat, not a place, but a realm, the underworld, a landscape unseen by waking eyes, more vast than the deserts, more layered than the sky. It was not a punishment ground, nor a mere resting place. It was a mirror, one that did not show your face but your essence. And no pharaoh could rule in the light until he had looked into that mirror and not flinched. From childhood, he was taught to walk as if watched because he was. Every action was a rehearsal for judgment. Every breath, a step closer to a door only he could unlock. The rituals of life were not for ceremony, but for orientation. To die unprepared was not just foolish, it was catastrophic. For in the Jewat, memory twisted, time folded, and monsters wore the faces of regrets left unresolved. The pharaoh did not fear death, but he feared being unworthy of what came after. In the temples, high priests would gather before dawn, speaking not of this world, but of what lay beneath it. Maps were drawn not on parchment, but in incantations. The Jewat had 12 gates, 12 hours of night, each more perilous than the last. There were guardians of fire, serpents of unmaking, lakes of flame that drank the names of the careless. These were not metaphors. These were preparations. For the pharaoh, it was not enough to believe in the afterlife. He had to navigate it. He had to know the spells, the names, the sacred questions, and their veiled answers. The Book of the Dead, or more truly, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was not a scripture. It was a survival manual, Every line was a step, every spell a lantern against the darkness. The pharaoh studied these not as scholar, but as traveler. He knew that every slip of tongue, every forgotten verse could cost him eternity. His tomb was not a grave. It was a vessel, a rehearsal hall, a sacred map built in stone. The walls told the journey not of conquest, but of surrender, of facing every part of himself that lived beyond his name. The ceilings above him were studded with stars, not for beauty, but for navigation. Beneath his resting body were carved rivers, monsters, gods, and doors, each one a reminder this is where you will go. This is what you must face. This is who you must become. In life, the pharaoh was rarely alone. In death, he would be utterly so. The Jewat held no allies, only echoes, and so he trained. The rituals of kingship mirrored the trials he would face. He learned how to walk through flame, how to name the guardians who would otherwise devour him. He learned the secret gestures, the passwords, the posture of humility before chaos. He learned to silence fear, for fear had a scent and the beasts of the Jewat could smell it. He was told there is no deception in the Jewat, not because it is pure, but because it is pure exposure. It does not punish, it reflects. The pharaoh would not be judged by gods, he would be judged by himself. His heart weighed against the feather of Mad, his confessions not shouted but drawn from his own soul like ink from a stone. And so in life he learned to master the art of balance, not to be perfect but to be aligned. Justice, truth, order, these were not moral codes but survival tools. To lie too often was to forget your own face. To betray was to fracture your essence. The Jewat would not forgive what was hidden. It would reveal it, magnify it, make it speak. There were those who believed the pharaohs were arrogant, believing themselves gods, but that was a misreading. They did not claim divinity. They carried it with weight, with silence, with terror. To be divine was to be responsible for every echo, every action, every thought. It was to know that your death would not end you, it would expose you. Not only to judgment, but to memory itself. The Jewat was layered with paradox, lightless yet filled with vision, still yet endless in motion. The dead did not walk it with legs, but with identity. The pharaoh, stripped of his body, would move through recognition. He could go only where his soul was welcome. He could open only what his truth could unlock, and so his preparation was not just ritual, it was self-knowledge. Some gates opened only when a name was spoken backwards. Others when silence was maintained through a hall of screaming faces. There were rivers that demanded you pour part of your memory into them. Mountains that only parted if you forgave someone you had wronged. These trials were not random, they were exacting, tailored to each soul. The pharaoh did not fear death, he feared not knowing himself well enough to survive it. And yet, for those who passed, the reward was not rest. It was transformation. If he succeeded, the pharaoh would not return as he was. He would merge with Osiris, with Ra, with the stars that never set. He would become one who shines, one who returns each night with the sun, guiding the living without name or face. Not worshipped, but remembered in the wind, in the rustle of palm leaves, in the strange silence before dawn. Those who failed did not suffer in flame. They vanished, forgotten, their names erased, their stories unspoken. For the ancient Egyptians, this was worse than torment. This was non-existence. A pharaoh feared no punishment more than oblivion, and so every breath was taken with intention. Every ritual, no matter how small, was a step along a road unseen. His life was not his own, it was a path he walked in service of a destination beyond the grave. Each act of kindness, each word of truth, each offering to the gods, they were not performances. They were preparations, keys for doors not yet visible. Even in sickness, the pharaoh would be asked what dreams he had, what visions stirred behind his closed eyes. For sometimes, the Jewat sent echoes, early glimpses, warnings, invitations. These were treated with reverence, studied by priests, woven into the spells prepared for his final journey. And when death finally came, not as thief but as mirror, the pharaoh was not mourned, he was honored, for he had spent his life preparing for this crossing. And as his body was wrapped in linen, his name whispered in ritual, his soul began to walk into the mirror, into the Jewat, and beyond. There is a death that even the dead fear, one that comes not with silence but with erasure. No tomb can hold it back, no title can bribe it, no spell once forgotten can undo it. The Egyptians called it the second death, and for pharaohs it was the terror that trailed even their final breath. To die once was inevitable, but to vanish afterward, to lose the name, the form, the path, that was the end beyond ends. And so, in hushed sanctuaries, behind walls that even priests feared to touch, they prepared forbidden rituals, rites of rebirth powerful enough to defy dissolution. The body was never just a vessel. It was a map, a blueprint through which the soul would navigate the next world. Every finger, every fold of flesh had purpose. Every scar was remembered. And so, when death came, the first urgency was preservation, not merely of shape, but of meaning. Embalmers were not morticians. They were engineers of resurrection. Their hands were steady, but their work was sacred. It was said they whispered prayers not to honor the pharaoh, but to keep their own souls intact, for to mishandle divinity was to risk the gods' gaze. The body was washed in waters drawn at night, beneath sacred stars. Oils scented with myrrh, lotus, and cedar were poured in silence. Each organ removed was treated as a living entity, bathed, blessed, placed within canopic jars guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. But the heart, the seat of judgment and identity, was left inside, unless fear of unworthiness demanded its removal. Then it was replaced with a stone heart, carved with spells that begged forgiveness. And still the body was not ready. For the pharaoh to truly return, not just exist in the Jewat, but rise beyond it, one ritual had to be performed. A ritual so secret it was spoken only once, the opening of the mouth. In this rite, the mummified pharaoh lay still, wrapped like silence itself, while a priest, or in rare cases the heir, approached with sacred tools, a blade of meteoric iron, a ceremonial adze, a spoon carved from tamarisk. They were not weapons. They were keys. Each tool touched the eyes, the lips, the ears, the nostrils of the dead, not to awaken the body, but to awaken memory. Sight was returned not to see, but to recognize. Speech not for words, but for invocation. Breath not for lungs, but for presence. The belief was simple and absolute. The pharaoh could not become until he could sense. And only when all 5 senses were ritually restored could he begin the journey toward his true form, The Ak, the radiant, effective being who transcended the human and stood among stars. But the ritual did not end there. What followed was known only to a few, the utterance of the unknown names. These were not recorded in papyri, not etched into tombs. They passed from priest to priest like flame through dry reed, illuminating, dangerous, and brief. These were the names the gods whispered at the dawn of time, the syllables with which the world had been called into shape. To speak them again over the Pharaoh's body was to reforge his essence, not as he had been, but as he would become. There are stories of priests who trembled during the recitation, whose voices failed mid-spell, whose hearts stopped at the final word, not from fear but from proximity. The gods, it was said, listened closely when their names were spoken backwards in the language of stars, and those unprepared to be heard risked being drawn in, dissolved, transformed into something unrecognizable. The Pharaoh, however, was ready. His soul had trained for this moment all his life. And now, with body preserved, mouth opened, and secret names sewn into the air, the final act began, the ritual of becoming a star. This was not metaphor. In the ancient mind, the sky was not above, it was beyond. The imperishable stars, those that never sank beneath the horizon, were believed to be the final resting place of the justified dead. But not all stars were the same. Some wandered, some flickered. Only a few became fixed, eternal. These were the pharaohs who had succeeded, whose rituals had held, whose names had endured. They were not looked at, they were looked to. And so the ceiling of the tomb was not left bare. It was painted with constellations, with spells of ascension, with maps only the soul could follow. The pharaoh would rise each night, carried by Ra's solar bark, traveling among deities who no longer appeared as animals or kings, but as movements of time, as laws made visible. To join them, he had to become like them, untouched by decay, immune to the second death. But it was not guaranteed. The spells had to be known. The tomb had to remain intact. The name had to be spoken by the living. If the priests faltered, if enemies defaced the wall, if the name was lost to time, the pharaoh's soul might falter in the Jewat, might lose its path, might forget its shape. And in that forgetting begin to fade. This is why names were repeated hundreds of times across amulets, statues, coffin lids, sarcophagi, not for vanity, for survival. The more a name was inscribed, the more chances it had to be spoken. The more it was spoken, the more real it became, and if real enough, eternal. But even then, the journey was not safe. The second death still hunted, not as a beast, but as silence. If no one remembered, if no one called, if no offering was made, the pharaoh would become dust, not in body, in memory, forgotten by the gods. Absent from the stars, to avoid this fate, the living made promises. Sons vowed to repeat the rituals. Priests swore to keep the temples lit. Entire festivals were founded not for celebration but for remembrance. Songs sung in sacred courtyards, meals laid out for spirits, prayers whispered before dawn. Not just because they loved the dead king, but because they feared what his absence would mean. For if even the pharaoh could be forgotten, what hope had they? But when the rites were complete, when the names were safe, when the tomb was sealed and the incense still lingered in the air, then the waiting began, not for decay, but for rise. and somewhere far beyond the veil a light appeared, steady, fixed, eternal. A pharaoh had passed the second death and become the sky. Buried beneath centuries of silence lies light meant for eternity. Not light to see by, but to be seen by, a presence, not an object. In the hidden architecture of Egypt's sacred landscape, there were structures no eye would gaze upon again, no hand would touch, no sound would stir. They were not lost, they were sealed. And in their silence they waited not for discovery, but for a single sliver of sunlight arriving once in 1,000 years to fall precisely where it must. To the ancient Egyptians, light was not passive. It was alive. A breath of Ra poured into the world to animate, to reveal, to consecrate. Temples and tombs were not merely shelters, they were mechanisms, instruments. Every angle carved, every stone placed, not for symmetry or strength, but for light. For that one divine moment when sun and stone would speak. Beneath the sand, far from the Nile's life-giving green, there were temples buried deliberately, their entrances erased from the world above. They were not meant to be visited. They were meant to remain in darkness until the day a particular alignment, a date, a season, a single dawn would bring a shaft of light through a narrow passage, illuminating the innermost chamber. Not by accident, by design. Inside a statue, not of grandeur but of stillness. A god or a pharaoh who had become one, eyes closed, lips sealed, waiting. And when that light struck just once, it was believed he saw again, heard again, awoke. To build such a thing required more than stone. It demanded communion with the sky. Priests tracked stars not to map the heavens, but to time the soul. They knew when Sirius would rise, when the solstice would shift, when the sun would enter its long descent toward the underworld. These weren't astronomical data points, they were instructions, and the temples obeyed them. Some shrines were aligned with the solstice. On that one day, light would crawl through a narrow tunnel like a golden snake and land on the heart of a sacred symbol. Others used equinoxes, the balance of day and night, to signal the crossing point between worlds. But the most mysterious were those aligned with death anniversaries. When a pharaoh passed from this world, the priests recorded the moment, then built a structure that would receive light only at that time of year. It was not a monument. It was a recurrence, and then they buried it. Why hide such marvels? Why shroud such beauty in secrecy? Because it was never meant for humans. It was a message to the gods, a confirmation he is still remembered, he still shines. Above ground the desert shifted, winds howled, dynasties rose and fell. But below the chamber remained untouched, until the light returned. Some modern archaeologists have stumbled upon these places only to realize they had arrived moments too soon or too late. The sun had already passed, the alignment missed by hours. The intended witness, the god, the spirit, had come and gone, leaving behind only geometry, silent, perfect, unfinished. The tombs, too, were woven with light. The pharaoh's final resting place was not chosen for its seclusion, but its orientation. The entry sloped not toward the earth, but toward the sky, matching the sun's descent at dusk. So that as the sun sank, it followed the king's path, or perhaps the other way around. In this way, the pharaoh did not simply go into the afterlife, he followed the light. Deeper within, shafts were carved with impossible precision. Some led to star fields, allowing the soul to ascend toward the imperishable constellations. Others aligned with Sirius, the star whose return marked the Nile's flooding and the rebirth of the land. To rise with Sirius was to return with abundance. To never set was to be immortal, but not all light was bright. Some temples were designed to capture dark light the moment before dawn when the sky breathes but has not yet spoken. A dim blue, so faint it seems imagined. This was the light of becoming, the threshold between non-existence and life. Rituals performed in this liminal glow were said to be the most potent because they were untouched by certainty. They asked the gods to remember when they were not yet formed, and light was not limited to the sun. Fires were lit in ways that mirrored constellations. Sacred oil lamps were placed to cast moving shadows that reenacted myths on temple walls. A flicker across a carving of Isis, and she seemed to move. A glow behind Anubis, and he appeared to breathe. This wasn't trickery. It was belief made tangible. Pharaohs understood that light was not just seen, it was felt, and more importantly, it remembered. It touched a thing and left an echo, so they crafted their tombs not to trap it, but to guide it. Let it pass once, mark the form, then leave. It's said that in certain tombs, the alignment was so precise that a beam of sunlight would strike the face of the pharaoh's statue only on his birthday or the day of his death. The rest of the year, darkness. One moment, one line, one memory etched in gold, but if that light missed, if the sky was clouded or the entrance collapsed, what then? That is why they built redundancies. Mirrors made of polished copper hidden deep in corridors, reflecting and redirecting light through impossible paths. Light split and bent through chambers, eventually landing where it was fated to go. The journey of a single ray became a parable. Obstacles may delay destiny but cannot prevent it. Some tombs were said to contain light traps, places where light would enter and never return. Absorbed by black stone, swallowed whole, these were warnings, places not to be visited. For those rooms held not souls but secrets, spells too dangerous for exposure. The pharaoh's true name, a god's last dream, the silence after creation. In one tale, a tomb was opened centuries after its sealing. The priests who broke the seal found a chamber filled with golden dust, and at its center a small pool of light, no source, no flame, just light gathered like water. They fled in reverence or fear. It was said that light had not left the room since the day the pharaoh died. Not all stories are true, but the fear and wonder they evoke is. Because in Egypt the sand does not only hide, it protects, it waits. And beneath it, in stillness beyond time, light continues its silent journey toward stone, toward memory, toward the eye of a god who has not yet blinked. The pharaoh understood what we often forget, that light is not only for now. It can be aimed, stored, promised. And in that promise, something eternal is kept, something the desert can never erase. Not gold, not crowns, only the heart and a single feather. In the end, when all temples have emptied and the sacred oils no longer burn, when the last hymn has faded and even the sand has ceased to shift, the pharaoh stands alone. No guards flank him now, no priest recites the ancient names, there is no throne beneath him, no crown upon his brow. Only silence, not cold but vast, a hush that waits, for this is the hall of Mad, and here nothing matters but truth. From birth, the Pharaoh had known this moment would come, not as a punishment but as the conclusion of a sacred pact. To live as a son of the gods was not a reward, it was a burden. Every law he passed, every word he spoke, every silence he allowed to fester, it all led here. And now, before Osiris, the judge of the dead, and the 42 divine assessors, his heart is called forth. It does not thud, it does not tremble. It floats, red, luminous, and silent, onto the golden scale. Across from it, a feather, not any feather, the feather of Maat, goddess of balance, truth, and order. She who was present before time, before gods had names, before the first star opened its eye. Her law governs not only people, but planets. It tames chaos and weaves harmony into the breath of existence. Even the gods submit to her, and now so must he. There is no pleading, no speeches. The heart speaks for itself. A life of choices flickers in its weight, kindness is shown in secret, mercy granted without witness, betrayals buried beneath grandeur. Every injustice carries its echo, every truth its light. The scale does not care for intentions, only balance. A heart too heavy sinks, burdened by lies, by cruelty, by arrogance disguised as strength. A heart too light, that too fails. For it means absence, a life unlived, a voice never raised, a duty abandoned, only balance. That is mad. In life, the Pharaoh had worn her symbol, a feather, etched in lapis and gold against his chest. He ruled not by sword, but by her will. The Nile flooded in Maat's time, crops grew in her rhythm. To disrupt her through injustice, corruption, false speech was to invite collapse. Chaos was not a monster. It was what came when Maat was forgotten, he remembered. Even as a child, he had been taught the 42 negative confessions, not commandments, but affirmations of restraint. I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not caused pain. They were spoken aloud each morning, not to others, but to the self. A daily reckoning, a soul in rehearsal, and still he doubted. For who can stand before Maat and not tremble? In his tomb, these confessions were carved into walls, repeated line by line, surrounding his resting form, not to shield him, but to remind him. That balance is not a moment, it is a life. Now the scale holds its breath. Anubis, guardian of the scales, watches, calm, unmoving. Thoth, the scribe, prepares his reed pen to inscribe the result, not in judgment, but in record. For even this verdict will become a star in the sky of memory. Should the heart outweigh the feather, there is only one fate, the devourer. Amit waits, crouched near the edge of eternity, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. She does not chase, she does not howl, she simply consumes. The unworthy heart, if heavy, is thrown to her jaws, and with that single bite the soul ceases. No afterlife, no return, no name spoken again, not even a whisper. But if the scale balances, the path opens. The Pharaoh becomes more than name, more than memory. He joins the Aku, the shining ones who rise with the sun and descend with the stars. He passes through the field of reeds where everything lost is restored, and the soul walks in harmony, harvesting joy like grain. The journey had always led here. Even in the grandeur of palaces, even in the firelight of sacred rites, the Pharaoh had always known that this was his true throne, the scale. and the law it upheld was not written in stone but in the fiber of being, a feather's truth, invisible, irrefutable. There is no spectacle, no proclamation. The balance is witnessed in stillness. Thoth writes, Anubis nods, Amit turns away. The Pharaoh's soul, now light, now whole, begins to rise. He does not speak, he remembers. He remembers the child kneeling in the temple, reciting prayers before he understood their meaning. He remembers the farmers whose hands he shook, the mother whose grief he quieted, the warrior he pardoned. He remembers his faults and how he tried to make them right. He remembers the silence of judgment and that he did not flinch. Above, the sky receives him, not with thunder, with light. One more star joins the dance, and beneath that eternal sky the sands shift gently, whispering his name, not in fear, not in worship, but in balance. As you sleep, know this: greatness is not measured by crowns or gold, but by the weight of a single heart and a single feather.